In 1775, a group of British soldiers were sent out of Boston Harbor to move into the interior of Massachusetts to the small towns of Lexington and Concord. Their objective was to capture stockpiles of weapons that locals had been hiding in these areas. They did not expect to meet with any sort of resistance. They had no idea that their movements had been watched for weeks by groups of people who quickly fled into the back country to warn the towns of Lexington and Concord that the British were on the way. We all know the story of Paul Revere's ride through the night where he yelled, "The British are coming! The British!" That actually did not happen. He had an excellent publicist, but that isn't actually what happened at all. In fact, Paul Revere never even completed the ride. He was arrested pretty quickly into it, and no one yelled, "The British are coming," because Americans still considered themselves to be British at that point, so that would have been really weird. What they yelled instead were, "The Redcoats are coming." And again, our friend Revere did not even make the full ride, unfortunately. So the British soldiers who march into Lexington and then later Concord are actually met with stiff resistance. And a firefight breaks out between them. Shots are fired to the point that the British flee, making their way back to Massachusetts. But they're hounded the entire way back by colonials hiding in the treetops, taking pot shots at them. Guerrilla warfare, something they never trained for. This becomes known as the first battles of what we now call the American Revolution or the American War for Independence. And this just happens to be that sort of event that our friends from the First Continental Congress decided was a thing for them to get back together. So a few weeks after this happens, all of those delegates make their way back to Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. This Congress gets a lot more done, mostly because they have a lot more issues to deal with. So they have some very pressing questions when they arrive in Philadelphia. They have some things they have to do. How do we fight a war? Because it looks like now we're fighting a war. So how do we do that? What are how do we even set up an army? We're depending on colonial militias, which are the equivalent today of the National Guard. We don't have an army. We don't have a system of officers. How do we do that? How are we going to govern these colonies until this war ends? What kind of, we're going to need a government. People need a government during a time of war. We don't have a unified government. We have 13 different little governments. How do we unify them to fight a war? And what are we even fighting this war for? What do we want to, what do we hope to gain out of this? These are the three questions that the Second Continental Congress has to solve really quickly if they're going to be successful. Now, the answer to the first question is George Washington. George Washington was one of the delegates. He'd actually shown up every single day to the Congress wearing a military uniform, basically just advertising the fact that he was a soldier with nothing much to do. When the Congress asks him to take control and form a continental army, he actually stands up and goes, "Wow, I didn't even know you guys would pick me for this. I am so unworthy." Dude had been advertising for weeks that he is a soldier with not a lot going on in his life. But he's actually an excellent choice, an excellent military mind. He's quickly able to create an army that can rival what was, at the time, the best trained army on Earth. So that fixes our first problem of what we're going to do about an army. We're going to put George Washington in charge, and we're going to let him figure that out on his own. The answer to the second question, how are we going to govern these colonies, actually ends up being pretty simple too. The Continental Congress decides that since they're all elected people, all of these men have been elected, that they can act as a representative government. And so the Continental Congress will become the operating government of America during this period. But what about that third question? What are we fighting for? That ends up being the more important question here. Are we fighting for independence? No one's actually said that yet. Are we fighting just to get representation in Parliament, to make England recognize us as equal parts of their empire? This is important for a variety of reasons because as we fight this conflict, we realize we're going to need support. We're going to need financial support and maybe even military support. But countries in Europe are apprehensive about getting involved because America can't articulate what it actually wants out of this conflict. Um, so, what is eventually going to happen is that America is going to initially decide to try one last ditch attempt to make peace with the king. They call this the Olive Branch Petition. They send King George III this long letter that's like, we like you. You're a good king. But Parliament has been really, really mean to us. And we want you to do something about that. They think they're basically getting on the king's side. It's the equivalent of us today when, you go and you ask your mom for something and your mom's like, absolutely not. And so then you go and you try to like butter up dad because you think dad will like be on your side and you basically are over there like, dad, mom's being crazy. Can you do something about that? This is basically what the colonists are doing here. They're appealing to the king and they're like, dad, mom, parliament is being crazy right now. And you probably haven't noticed that. So, maybe you could get on our side and help us. King George roundly does not accept the Olive Branch Petition. He writes a letter back saying, you guys are all in rebellion and I will crush you. So that's a little disappointing because now colonists have to think about, well, what does this mean now? We are in rebellion. Why are we in rebellion? Into this, a man named Thomas Paine writes a pamphlet. Now, we would call this like a short book. It is several dozen pages long, qualified as a pamphlet in colonial America called Common Sense. In this pamphlet, he argues that America should be free from England. And he does this in really an ingenious way. Part of his argument hinges on arguments of the Enlightenment and arguments of science, arguments which would appeal to well-educated Americans. But he also uses biblical analogies and common everyday analogies to argue that America should be free, things that would appeal to less well-educated people. So this man has managed to create a book with wide appeal. He has arguments that appeal to well-educated people and arguments that appeal to people who are less educated. Common Sense becomes America's first bestseller. And Americans all over begin to talk about independence, that perhaps independence is the reason we should be doing this. That summer, a man from Virginia will stand up and actually just blatantly say it in Congress. We should be free. But the Continental Congress doesn't do that right away. That's a rash step to say we're fighting for independence. And so instead, they put together a group of men led by a young lawyer from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson to draft a petition, draft a Declaration of Independence. They make no promises about whether they'll accept it or not. They just want to see what comes out of it. Now, this is one of those weird group projects where a lot of people are in the group, but most of the work was done by one person, and that's Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson writes a document that is in two parts. The first part is sort of a preamble, an introduction, which lays out the reasons why America thinks they should have independence. And in this, he rips off Enlightenment thinker John Locke, something you'll learn more about in AP Gov. The second half is the list of grievances. It's all these specific reasons that America feels like it has been wronged by England. So, as one person put it, this is America's epic breakup letter to England. The first part is America going, it's not you, it's me. The second part is America going, but here are all the reasons it's actually you and not me. When this is brought before the committee actually, or the Congress actually votes for independence on July 2nd. Yeah, I know. It's a great moment. We celebrate July 4th because that's when it was made public and when it was finalized and finally signed. But they'd actually voted to accept it 2 days earlier. They asked Jefferson to make a few minute changes, and they needed time to make up a nice, fancy copy for them to all sign that would be sent to England. And that took a couple of days. So technically, we declared our independence on July 2nd, not July 4th. July 4th is just when everyone else found out about it. So we've now decided we are fighting for our own independence. And that means we can start asking countries like France for financial and military help. We appeal to France because remember, France lost that 7 years war to England. And honestly, they've been itching to get even with England. But even though they want some revenge against England, they're not too sure about the Americans. And so the French tell the Americans they need one good victory, one good military victory over the British to prove they can actually win this war. That victory comes in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga, where the Americans roundly defeat an entire regiment of the British and take them prisoner. This proves to France and to other European countries that America could potentially win this war. And so Saratoga ends up being an important battle and one that you are actually required to know for the AP exam because it convinces European countries to side with America. So France will sign an alliance with the American colonies. This is the Treaty of Alliance of 1778, in which they pledge military support to the United States, or not even the United States yet, to the colonies, to help them win their War of Independence, with an agreement that at the end of this conflict, there will be preferential trade agreements given to France. The Netherlands will also begin making loans, and other countries like Spain will get involved, helping the US by providing naval support. So this becomes an important turning point, being able to decide exactly what we want in this war and prove that we can, in fact, win it. With the help of the French, we do, in fact, win the American Revolution. And we are able to gain our independence in the treaty which ends the revolution. Now, we have independence, but now we have to decide what this brand new country is actually going to look like. And that ends up being a lot harder than we thought. I'm going to try a couple of different things to get there. And we'll talk about those in the next video.